Something I was thinking about the other day is the power of connection. It's actually something I think about a lot, something I incorporate a lot in my work, whether that be individually with people, with groups, parenting, whatever the context be. But I was just thinking, I wonder if connection is commonly an underutilized nutrient in your relationships. Some of the background there, right? Well, what do I mean by that? First of all, I think it's really helpful to use language of nutrients when we're talking about relational stuff, connection stuff, trust, right? These different dynamics or these different really elements, these different factors that are super important in relationships. So things like vitamin B, we know we need it. Things like iron, we know we need it, right? And if you don't have some of these things and there's a deficiency, there's some different diagnosis or consequence or symptom of that deficiency. So I love incorporating the language of nutrients when we're talking about this. So now that you have that lens, that language, I want to hone in on what we're wired for. And we know we are wired for connection. We come into this world wired as relational beings. And we know from child development, from neuroscience, from lots of different research-oriented data collections, that our brains don't develop without connection. And that relationships without connection, well, I guess they're not really much of relationships, right? They might be more acquaintances. They might be more of some kind of professional dynamic or just some kind of contract exchange situation rather than a true relationship. So I want you to think through how present or absent or maybe inconsistent is connection as a nutrient in your relationships. So think of it this way. We know early on child development, to give a little example, when we are born, right? If you're a teeny tiny tot, right? And you're being cradled, you're being held like this. We know that our visual abilities at that point is literally about this distance, right? It's roughly 8 inches. Interesting when you think about, the importance of my ability fresh into the world, being able to see and connect to a caregiver, hopefully a safe caregiver, right? But honing in on that connection, we think about how often, especially early on, little ones need connection to regulate their bodies. They need connection to get their needs met, to things like diaper changes, feedings, of course. So we know connection is important, but I'm curious for you, do you use connection as a primary way to address big feelings today in your adult relationships, in your parent-to-child relationships, peer-to-peer, whatever that might look like? Do you use connection to lean into conflict and problem solve? Do you use it to discipline when necessary? Again, kind of back to the original question of, I wonder if connection is actually really underutilized in our day-to-day. So what would it look like if you were to start incorporating this more? If you were to start making this a little more robust and more intentional in some of these situations? What does it look like for you and your adult relationships to increase connection when we're actually having more problems? Right? Because when we increase connection, when we're arguing more, or we just haven't had, maybe it's with your spouse, like a date night or something like that, when we increase the connection, our ability to be seen is better, right? Our proximity to you and just feeling close to you changes. Our empathy and compassion for one another tends to increase. Our attunement to what's really going on, maybe underneath the argument, whatever the problem might be, all of those things tend to improve when we know how to incorporate and utilize connection as our primary source of leaning into that issue. Similar, of course, if you're parenting, right? And you probably can think of examples like this when, oh, I noticed my little one was having a hard time and they couldn't figure it out on their own. But actually, when I just became closer to them, maybe it was just proximity. Maybe it was eye contact, right? Like actual visual connection. Maybe it was just physical side by side. In whatever form you utilize that connection, have you observed that your kiddos' behaviors, their problem solving skills, their frustrations, those things change? Right? So I want to just bring that to our attention of utilizing connection as a primary way to engage in relationship, of course, but to also respond to problems, to challenges, to discipline needs. And how could you make that a little more robust? How could you make that more foundational for your day-to-day experiences? And I'm curious to hear feedback on, I actually did it in this one area and I think it worked, or I actually have no idea how to do that, right? I'd love to hear feedback on what it looks like for you, what's challenging, what you actually notice when you apply it, and or maybe what you notice you've never considered in this regard, right? Maybe you've just never considered connection as such a beneficial and practical nutrient, even in problem situations. So there's a conversation today, just remembering that we're wired for relationship. We have a vital need of connection in relationship, and we can actually use connection as a way to resolve issues, challenges, or problems with one another.